dim the lights, turn on a fan if the night is warm. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Welcome back, fellow night wanderer. Tonight, we descend into a world that feels like it was carved from ink and shadow, where beauty and brutality lived side by side, and silence could be more dangerous than a sword. This is no bedtime story, though you might drift off with it echoing in your thoughts. It's a whispered memory of a time that moved slow and sharp, like a blade gliding through silk. Feudal Japan. A land of lacquered armor, cherry blossoms, and secrets buried deeper than any samurai's oath. You've heard of the honor, the rituals, the warrior code etched in generations. But what about the silence beneath all that, the people who lived not in legend, but in the margins? Merchants, daughters, hidden believers, their stories rarely made it into scrolls, yet they bore the weight of an empire's contradictions. They endured, quietly. Tonight, we trace the fragile thread of one such family, the Tanakas, as they navigate a life of stitched silks, forbidden faith, and the constant edge of survival. Let's begin. The air in Edo never truly stood still. Even at night, it carried the faint scent of damp wood, fish oil, and the distant smoke of cooking fires curling through narrow alleys. For the Tanaka family, this scent was as familiar as the ache in their bones. It meant the shop had closed, the bolts of silk were packed away for the night, and they had survived another day. Their world was small, a cramped wooden building wedged between a lacquerware shop and a pawnbroker. It smelled of dye, thread, and old incense. The eldest son, Haruki, would often rise before dawn to prepare the shop floor, unrolling swaths of silk with care, like unwrapping something sacred. Their customers, noble women with pale faces and slow, rehearsed voices, never looked Haruki in the eye. They never saw the cracked skin of his hands, or the rice husks beneath his nails. But they ran their fingers across the silk he had cut and stitched late into the night. The Tanakas did not wear the garments they made. They could not. That would have been a violation. In the rigid architecture of class, a kimono was not just clothing. It was a boundary, a declaration. Merchants like the Tanakas were to remain plain, silent, and grateful for what little space they were allowed to occupy. Even so, the garments they crafted were beautiful. Painfully beautiful. Indigo waves curling along a hem. Crimson maple leaves scattered across a sleeve. Each stitch a small rebellion against the grayness of their place. They lived off millet and pickled radish, sometimes a turnip, seldom meat. Every coin they made was folded back into the shop into new dye, new thread, a small bribe here, a hidden tax there. Living on the edge wasn't a dramatic turn of phrase for the Tanakas, it was arithmetic. It was the sound of rice counting out loud as it fell into a tin bowl. But it wasn't hunger or taxes that haunted the Tanakas most. It was the secret. Hidden in a drawer beneath bolts of fabric was a tiny wooden crucifix, worn smooth from the touch of generations. A rosary, coiled and wrapped in paper, the pages of a gospel smuggled from Nagasaki. Christianity, outlawed by decree, was no longer just heresy, it was treason. A whisper of faith could lead to interrogation. A prayer could bring death. Still, they prayed. In hushed tones at night, long after the streets quieted, they spoke to a god who had no place in their country anymore. Not the gods of rice or thunder or ancestors, but one of compassion, of sacrifice, of quiet redemption. For the Tanakas, this faith was not a bold act of defiance. It was survival spiritual, if not physical. They did not preach. They did not convert. They simply remembered. And in that memory, they endured. There was no room for dreams in the Tanaka household, only repetition. Children learned the trade early. Little Aiko, barely old enough to speak, was already learning to wind thread between her tiny fingers. Her brother, Ren, could distinguish dyes by scent before he could read. Education, beyond what the work demanded, was a luxury they could not afford. Still, late at night, their mother would whisper stories, not fairy tales, but verses. Parables. Psalms. She told them to keep the children still, to lull them to sleep, but deep down, it was an anchor. A lifeline passed from mother to child like a candle hidden beneath the floorboards. The neighborhood knew not to ask questions. Whispers traveled fast in Edo, to fast. A merchant's smile could be read as arrogance, a delay in bowing as disrespect. Even laughter, if heard at the wrong hour, could be considered an insult. So the Tanakas learned to keep their heads down. Their silence was not apathy. It was armor. And yet, they still felt the weight of the code. In feudal Japan, even joy had to follow the rules. Sumptuary laws dictated what could be worn, eaten, owned, and more importantly, by whom. Silk was for the samurai, vibrant dyes were for courtiers. Merchants could sell, but not wear. Peasants could grow rice, but not taste it. There were rules for shoes, hairstyles, fences, teacups. There were even rules about laughter. Dancing was indecent. Music, unless it honored the elite, was frivolous. A woman who wore too much rouge could be fined. A man who built his home too high could be arrested, all of it designed to keep people in their place. To erase ambition from the lower classes, to kill hope before it had the audacity to bloom. And for those like the Tanakas, the rules weren't just about conformity. They were about survival. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Haruki would stand by the narrow window and watch the samurai walk past, polished, silent, perfect in posture. He wondered what they felt, if behind those stoic eyes there was anger, shame, joy. Or if they too were just playing parts in a theater none of them could leave. He didn't envy them. Not exactly. But he did wonder what it would be like to be seen. Not just glanced at. Not just tolerated. But truly seen for what he built with his hands, for what his family preserved in their hearts, for the quiet resilience of a life lived at the edge of someone else's script. In the Tanaka's world, love was not declared in words, but in shared silence. In a bowl of warm water for sore feet, in a glance that meant stay quiet, in a whispered prayer that might be the last. Theirs was not a heroic story. There were no battles, no legends, just survival, but perhaps. Survival is a kind of rebellion. Perhaps faith, kept quietly alive under centuries of dust and fear, is braver than any sword. The Tanakas did not ask for history to remember them, but tonight. We will. Close your eyes if you haven't already. We're only just beginning. The mornings came early in Edo, and they came with a sound, not a song, not a bell. But the scratch of straw sandals on stone, the low creak of wooden shutters, the muffled grunt of someone lifting rice sacks onto a cart. The city never truly slept, but it had its rhythms, and for those like the Tanakas, those rhythms were law, predictable, inescapable. By the time the first pale light crept through the paper shutters, Haruki was already awake. He didn't need a rooster to call him. His body knew when it was time, the aching knees, the tightness in his fingers, the stiff throb behind his eyes. These were his clocks, his inheritance. He rose quietly, careful not to wake the others. The room smelled of old fabric and sweat and something faintly sweet, dried persimmons maybe, or the candle wax they used the night before. He reached for his work robe. It was thin, patched along the shoulders, and smelled faintly of lye soap. He wore it like armor. Outside, the sky was the color of ash. The streets were wet with morning mist, as though the city itself had exhaled in its sleep. The first thing Haruki did each day was sweep the street in front of the shop. It was not required, but it was expected. Clean paths, clean shop. The merchant's reputation depended not on truth, but on appearances. The silk they sold was judged by how spotless the storefront looked, how crisp their bows were, how silent they could become in the presence of a higher class. He swept in long, steady strokes, the way his father had taught him. Not too fast, not too slow, always from right to left. Always ending at the threshold. Inside, his mother, Kyo, was already preparing the morning meal. Not cooking, there was little to cook, just rice gruel, watered down to stretch the grain, and a sliver of pickled plum if they were lucky. She moved quietly in the shadows, her sleeves tied back, her hair wound tight. Her hands were raw from years of dye work, and her knuckles had grown stiff. But still, she prepared the morning like it was a ritual, because it was. In a life with few certainties, meals, even small ones, meant order. And order, for the lower classes, was a form of defense. The younger children stirred in the loft above, their feet thudding softly as they climbed down the ladder one by one. Aiko held her little doll, a ragged thing made from old silk scraps. Ren followed behind her, already yawning, already rubbing his eyes like a cat. Their father, Doichi, sat by the workbench, eyes narrowed in the half-light as he trimmed thread from a nearly finished kimono. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He could feel the day sliding into place, one obligation at a time. This was their life. Quiet. Exacting. Invisible. But there were cracks. They came in small ways, the lingering cough in Kyo's lungs, the soft click sound Daichi made with his jaw when he was nervous, the way Haruki paused for just a second too long whenever a government official passed by the shop. They were not mistakes, not yet. But they were signals that the edges were fraying, that something was pressing in. A new tax had been announced the week before. Silk import fees were rising again, a move designed to squeeze the merchant class further, even as the upper echelons continued their rituals and feasts. It was said the shogun wanted to curb indulgence. But indulgence, in truth, had never belonged to the Tanak as it belonged to those who could afford uselessness, to those who wore silk not because it was earned, but because it was declared. Still, the Tanakas did not complain, they adapted. That morning, Daichi passed down the decision. They would switch to second-grade dye for the upcoming orders. It would fade faster, but it would stretch the coin. Kyo's mouth tightened at the news, not in disapproval, but in mourning. She had once prided herself on the brightness of their garments. Now, she would have to let that go. Haruki said nothing. He simply turned back to the ledger, writing with careful, practiced strokes, adjusting the prices, recalculating the margins. There was a certain numbness to it all, not despair. Just the kind of quiet erosion that turns worrying into habit. And yet, beneath that silence, the crucifix remained, hidden but constant. At night, when the city exhaled again, and the wind stirred faintly through the bamboo eaves, the Tanakas would gather in the back room. No candles, just moonlight. The children would kneel, heads bowed. Kyo would whisper a verse. Daichi would trace a sign across his chest, the motion nearly invisible in the dark. Haruki's voice was the softest. But his heart, perhaps, was the heaviest. He had begun to wonder, not whether the faith was worth keeping, but whether it was worth passing on. The world was not getting kinder, the rules were not loosening. And he knew too well what the penalty could be. Not just for him, for the whole family. Was it selfish? This desire to preserve something so dangerous. Was it pride, or was it something deeper? A refusal to be erased. Faith had to hide, but silence could be holy, too. That night, as the wind knocked gently against the walls, Haruki sat awake long after the others had slept. He watched the moonlight spill in through the cracks, painting the floor in pale shapes. He thought of the noble woman who had visited that day, the one with white teeth and a fan made of feathers. She had spoken in a slow, rhythmic voice, choosing fabric like she was tasting it with her eyes. She had laughed once, not loud, but sharp, when she heard Haruki mispronounce a word in the imperial dialect. She would never remember him. But he would remember her. He would remember the weight of her gaze, the sound of her sandals against the floorboards, the way she had folded the kimono as if it were already hers, as if it had never passed through tired hands, through hunger, through whispered prayers in the dark. There is no word, in any language, for the ache of being unseen. Haruki closed his eyes, and for a moment, he let himself feel it not as shame, but as truth. Somewhere, outside, a rooster called. Dawn again. And still. They endured. Even the dust that settled on their shelves had a kind of resilience. Quiet, patient. Waiting to be swept, waiting to return. Just like them. The next day would come. The orders would pile, the dye would stain. The silence would deepen. But the faith, small, hidden, and flickering, would remain. For now, let it stay. Let it burn. The sound came first, a soft, rhythmic knock at the front door. Not loud, not urgent, but deliberate. 3 slow taps, then silence. Haruki froze mid-stitch, the fine silk bunch gently between his fingers. His eyes flicked to the door, then to his father. Daichi didn't speak. He simply exhaled, not heavily, but just enough to empty his lungs. That sound, more than any knock, told Haruki that something was wrong. Visitors never came this early, and never unannounced. Kyo emerged from the back room, drying her hands on her work cloth, her mouth drawn tight. Little Aiko, still holding her doll, looked up from the floor with curious eyes. She was too young to feel the shift in the room. But Ren, just old enough to understand silence, reached instinctively for her hand. The knock came again. This time, Daichi rose. He did not hurry. He did not stiffen. He smoothed the sleeves of his robe, adjusted his posture, and walked slowly toward the door. Every step calculated. Merchant dignity was a mask, and masks had to be worn carefully, even when they cracked. He slid open the door. 2 men stood there. One wore the muted robes of a local tax officer, navy gray, thin-lipped, expressionless. The other, younger, had a wakizashi at his side and eyes that wandered the shop with quiet judgment. Not samurai, not quite, but close enough to bring trouble. Tanaka Daichi. The older man asked. Yes, honored sir. Daichi replied with a bow low enough to scrape humility, but not so low it signaled guilt. We are here for a routine check of merchant registrations and stock ledgers, the man said. Routine. A lie they both understood. Daichi bowed again. Of course. Please, come in. The two officials stepped inside. Their sandals left faint prints in the dust of the floor. Haruki remained where he was, his hands still on the silk, though now his breath came shallow and slow. Behind him, Kyo reached for the ledger. Her fingers trembled slightly. The inspection began. They asked for names, for proof of registration, for tax receipts, stamped in red ink by the magistrate's seal. Everything was in order, at least, everything on paper. But these visits were not about records. They were reminders, a performance of power. The younger man trailed his fingers along the dyed fabric, his mouth pursed slightly. This color, he murmured. Indigo this deep isn't cheap. Kyo's voice was quiet. We use a reduced pigment blend, sir. It fades quickly. Most noble customers prefer it for practice garments. He didn't respond. But his fingers lingered on the fabric for just a moment longer than necessary before moving on. When the inspection finally ended, the older man turned to Daichi. Everything appears to be in order. However, he paused. A small, deliberate pause. We've noticed your family has not contributed to the neighborhood festival this year. The incense fund, the lanterns. Such things are expected of long-standing merchants. No. Daichi bowed again. Of course, sir. Forgive the delay. We will make our contribution by week's end. The man smiled without warmth. Very good. We'll return to confirm. And with that, they left. No threats. No violence. Just a warning wrapped in politeness. The kind that cuts deeper than any blade. The silence they left behind was suffocating. Daichi closed the door and stood with his back to it, unmoving. Kyo set the ledger down, her eyes fixed on the floor. Haruki finally let out the breath he'd been holding. Even the children seemed to understand now. Aiko clutched her doll a little tighter. Ren stood stiff as a reed. They're watching us, Daichi said softly. More than usual. Kyo nodded. Someone's spoken. Someone suspects. No one said the word. Christian. But it hung there anyway, in the air between them. Later that evening, the house was quieter than usual. The children were sent to bed early. The shop was locked tight. Daichi lit a single taper and placed it in the back room, next to the drawer where the crucifix lay hidden. He stared at the drawer for a long time. Then turned away. In the dark, Haruki sat by the small table, rubbing the heel of his palm. It was raw from the day's work, the skin nearly splitting. Kyo knelt beside him, hands resting in her lap. I can move the rosary, she said quietly. Hide it in the dye pots. No one checks those. Haruki shook his head. If they're searching for signs, it won't matter where we hide them. They'll find something. He didn't mean the objects. He meant the posture, the silences, the shadows beneath their eyes. Faith, after all, was not always visible. But it left traces in rhythm, in gaze, in the way they bent their heads not to emperors, but to something higher. Was it worth it? That question had no answer. Not for them. The Tanakas did not speak in absolutes. They endured. They hoped. They prayed in languages older than their shame. Outside, the wind picked up, a soft, lonely howl that slipped through the slats in the roof. It rattled the shutters gently, like a question whispered against wood. In the darkness, Daichi spoke again, not to anyone in particular. They'll come again, next time with more questions. Maybe someone from the higher office. We need to be ready. Kyo's voice was low. If they ask about the girl's pendant, I'll say it's decorative. Haruki looked toward the loft, where Aiko slept with her hand curled around the tiny wooden charm she wore on a string. It was carved from plum wood, shaped like a flower. But inside, beneath the carved petals, was a tiny cross. A secret nestled in beauty. She shouldn't wear it, he whispered. She's just a child, Kyo said. She doesn't understand. She doesn't have to. They will. The night deepened. The flame in the taper bent sideways, as though bowing to something invisible. Daichi stood again, walked to the small altar, and gently lifted the crucifix from its cloth. He held it in both hands, not with reverence, but with weariness, like it was both a comfort And await. There may come a time, he said, when we bury this, not to hide it, but to keep it safe. From them, from us. From time. Haruki's voice was almost a whisper. And when we dig it up again, will we still remember what it meant? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with 1,000 years of forgotten names, of secret prayers, of tears that never reached the ground. The wind rattled the shutters once more, and the candle, slowly, died. The morning after the inspection came with a different kind of silence, not the ordinary, lived-in hush of early labor, but something stiller. As though the very air held its breath, Haruki didn't move right away when he woke. He lay flat on the narrow mat, eyes open, staring at the grain of the wooden ceiling above. The boards creaked faintly with the shifting weight of someone moving in the loft above, probably Ren. Even the soft thuds of bare feet seemed louder today. Or maybe it was just that everything felt thinner, more breakable. He rose slowly, every movement careful. Not because of pain, but because of the feeling that something invisible now walked beside them, something watching, waiting for a misstep. Outside, the streets of Edo had already come alive. Vendors shouting softly through cupped hands, wheels creaking over stone, the distant clack of Geta sandals tapping their rhythm through alleyways. But none of it reached inside the Tanaka shop. Not truly. Not today. Kyo was already seated near the back, working the dye vat with steady, practiced hands. The room smelled thick with indigo and vinegar. She didn't look up as Haruki entered, but her voice reached him with quiet clarity. We need to prepare something for the festival. They'll expect it. Haruki nodded, though she wasn't watching. What do we offer? We can't spare incense. She stirred the vat. The stick scraped slowly along the edge. Silk scraps. Lantern paper, maybe. Something humble. Haruki glanced toward the shelf where they kept their remnants. Most were too small or too afraid to be of value. Humility was expected from their class, expected and demanded. They would make something delicate, something beautiful. And pray it was enough. I returned just before midday, his face drawn from the walk to the official quarter. His sandals were muddy, a bad sign he'd been kept waiting. They want a formal submission, he said as he stepped inside. A record of our suppliers, full names, locations, dye origins. Kyo looked up sharply. That's not standard. No, he said. It isn't. Haruki felt the chill of that. If they were being asked to name suppliers, it meant something deeper, something more than a tax matter. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about allegiance, about purity, about control. Doichi sat heavily on the floor, stretching one leg. We'll forge some of it. Say we buy from the southern ports. Keep it vague. What if they cross-check? Haruki asked. Then we pray they don't. Aiko appeared at the doorway then, rubbing her eyes. She still wore her little pendant, the flower-carved charm with its hidden cross. It swung gently as she walked. Daichi's gaze flicked toward it. She can't wear that anymore, not even indoors. Kyo hesitated. She doesn't understand why. She doesn't need to, Doichi said, his voice low. She just needs to obey. That night, they sat around the hearth in silence. No prayers, not opally. Just the soft, unspoken weight of them, like vapor curling against the walls. Haruki stared into the small flame, watching it bend and shift, thin and golden. Firelight in Edo was never indulgent. They burned all sparingly, every drop accounted for. But tonight, the flame seemed different, like it knew it wasn't supposed to be a comfort. He wondered what would happen if they were taken. He'd heard the stories. Families dragged from their homes at night. Interrogations that didn't end until the answers were what the magistrates wanted. Tortures designed not to kill, but to teach. Crucifixions left standing on the outskirts of the city, the condemned held up as warnings in the morning mist. He tried not to imagine Kyo screaming, or Daichi refusing to confess, or Aiko, too young to know why the world was suddenly sharp and cruel. But the mind goes where it must. That night, he dreamed of drowning. Not in water, but in fabric. Bolts of silk wrapping around him, dragging him down. Each thread tighter than the last. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see. He woke gasping, his mouth open, but no sound escaping, just the hum of the city outside. The next morning, the offering for the festival was ready. It was a lantern, small, simple, made from off-cut silk and old bamboo reeds, but it was beautiful. Kyo had painted it herself, with a brush she hadn't used in years. Pale cranes flying over a mountain lake, the sky dotted with plum blossoms. It told no stories of faith, no hints of who they were, just an image of serenity, of balance. A lie, in other words. A beautiful, necessary lie. Ren was chosen to deliver it. Haruki helped him tie the cord, adjusting the lantern so it wouldn't lean to one side. Before Ren left, Daichi knelt and placed a hand on his shoulder. Walk slow, smile, bow deeply to everyone, even those who don't deserve it. Say nothing unless spoken to, and if anyone asks about our faith. You don't understand. You're just a boy. Understood, Ren nodded. He didn't look afraid, he just looked older. Somehow. The lantern swayed gently as he disappeared down the street. They waited. Every minute stretched thin, every creak of the floorboards, every voice outside, every sound of footsteps that didn't stop, it all struck like a match to dry straw. Kyo stood by the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron even though they were already clean. Daichi paced. Kyo played silently in the corner, stacking stones, unaware of how much was resting on her. When Ren returned an hour later, the relief was so deep it hurt. They took it, he said simply. The official nodded. He said it was tasteful. Double quotes tasteful. The word sat in Haruki's mind like ash. That night, they prayed again. Only briefly. Only once, a soft grace whispered in the dark. It wasn't joy they felt. It wasn't even peace. Just a breath. A pause. A moment of quiet above the waterline before the tide pulled again. They knew it wasn't over. Survival wasn't something you won. It was something you repeated. One careful day at a time. Outside, the festival lights began to rise. Strings of paper lanterns, glowing orange and gold, stretched across alleyways like low-hanging stars. Laughter rang in the streets. Drums beat in the distance. Inside the Tanaka home, there were no songs, no sake, no dancing, but in a drawer beneath the floorboards, the crucifix remained. Unburied. Unbroken. Waiting. Edo in festival season was a strange contradiction. The city painted in joy but carved in fear. The streets gleamed with lantern light, every corner hung with soft colors, cranes, blossoms, and painted moons. Children ran barefoot past rice stalls and puppet shows, their laughter slicing the evening air into ribbons. Flutes played in tight alleyways, their high notes drifting upward like incense smoke toward a sky the color of burnt tea. But joy was permission, not free. The festival was not for everyone, not truly. It was for the display of unity, of order. For the reaffirming of who belonged where. The shogun's men watched from balconies and shaded verandas, arms folded into their sleeves, faces unreadable. To step out of one's place, to show too much joy, too much color, too much self, was to risk being noticed. And being noticed in Edo was dangerous. The Tanaka stayed inside. From the loft window, Haruki could see the procession moving past their street, dancers in layered robes, their sleeves like waves. Drummers with shaved heads and solemn faces. Priests carrying symbols of the local kami through clouds of white smoke. It was beautiful, painfully so, the kind of beauty that made your chest hurt. But it wasn't theirs. They watched it the way one watches the moon, from a distance, silently, carefully. Daichi sat at the workbench, sewing even as the festival passed outside their very walls. His hands moved without thought. The work was steady, rhythmic, like breathing. Every stitch was an act of devotion, not to the craft, but to the life it allowed them to maintain. He had once dreamed, briefly, of passing the shop to Haruki one day, of expanding, of earning enough to rent a second stall, maybe even one closer to the central market. Now, he just hoped they'd be left alone. Ren asked if we could go outside, Kyo said quietly, standing at the threshold between the back room and the shop. Just to see the dancers. Daichi didn't look up. Did you say no? I didn't have to, she replied. He knew. Haruki turned from the window, the glow of the lantern still warm on his face. We could take him tomorrow. Just for a moment. In the crowd. No. Daichi's voice was flat. It's too exposed. And we have more to lose than we did last week. There was a pause, heavy, familiar. Kyo stepped forward. You can't keep him a prisoner, Daichi. He's a child. We're all prisoners, he said. We just pretend not to be. He set his needle down and rubbed his eyes. The lines on his face had grown deeper this week, as if each hour carved something new. He was only in his 40s, but in this light, he looked older. Like someone from a different time, already half turned to smoke. In the quiet that followed, Aiko sang softly to her doll, a tune with no words. Just a hum, sweet, soft, the kind of sound that didn't belong in a home like theirs, a sound of freedom. She didn't know better. But even her small, innocent voice made Kyo flinch. Not now, she whispered. Hush. The child looked up, confused, but obeyed. And that was the part that broke Haruki's heart more than anything, how quickly obedience had become instinct. Later that night, after the procession had passed, and the drums had quieted to the occasional thump like a distant heartbeat, Haruki slipped outside. Not far, just to the edge of the street. He stood there in the warm dark, watching the last lanterns sway in the breeze, their silk skins glowing like fireflies suspended in prayer. Across the way, a street performer finished his act. 2 coins clinked into a wooden bowl. A mother pulled her child away, scolding gently. He remembered when he was younger how the world felt big and loud and full of wonder. He remembered chasing dragonflies through the reed fields. He remembered believing deeply, foolishly that if he worked hard enough, if he bowed deeply enough, he might one day be seen. He laughed. Just once, a bitter, breathless sound, and then a whisper, "You shouldn't be out alone." Haruki turned. A figure stood in the shadows, not samurai. But not a commoner either. His robes were plain but tailored, his posture distrait. His eyes, sharp. "I'm just watching the lights," Haruki said, steadying his voice. The man stepped forward. "You're Tanaka Haruki." "Yes," Haruki froze. "I am." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I saw your family's lantern. Very tasteful. Very humble." Haruki bowed. "We're honored it pleased the officials." The man took another step. "Tell me something. Do you believe beauty comes from the gods? Or from man?" Haruki blinked. I wouldn't know how to answer." The man said. "Interesting." There was silence, then just the creak of lantern cords swaying in the breeze. The man stared at Haruki a moment longer, then stepped back into the dark. "Be careful what you create," he said. "Sometimes beauty is more dangerous than truth." And then he was gone. Haruki didn't breathe for a long time. When he returned home, he said nothing. But he did not sleep that night. He sat by the window, listening to the sounds of the city's joy fade into ash. He watched the lanterns go out, one by one, until the street was just shadows and silence. In the dark, he reached into his sleeve and touched the tiny paper scrap he kept folded against his arm. A verse. One he'd written years ago in a trembling hand. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He had written it for courage. But tonight, it felt more like a warning. And somewhere below, in the silence of the drawer, the crucifix waited still. Not yet buried. Not yet broken. By morning, the festival had ended, but the city did not return to normal. It never really did. The colors were taken down, the banners rolled up, the streets swept, but something always lingered after. Not just the ashes of incense or the wax from spilled lanterns, but a tension, thin as spider silk, stretched over every rooftop. The people of Edo returned to their positions like players stepping back onto a stage, careful not to forget their lines. Merchants opened their shutters with a practiced bow. Farmers rolled their carts along the stone paths with bent backs and silent mouths, and the watchmen strolled the alleys just a little slower, as if they were listening for the sound of something unspoken. Inside the Tanaka shop, the silence continued. Haruki sat behind the counter, mending the hem of a crimson obi. The silk was fine, fraying slightly at the edge. His stitches were steady, but slower than usual. His eyes were elsewhere, still caught in the sharp glint of the man who had spoken to him the night before. Do you believe beauty comes from the gods? Or from man? It wasn't a question. Not really. It was a thread. And threads, he had learned, could unravel entire lives. Kyo sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, trimming dyed silk into fan shapes for a court order. Her hands moved with the old rhythm, her breath steady, but her shoulders were tense. Every few minutes, her eyes flicked toward the front door, as if expecting another knock. Daichi had gone out at dawn. He claimed it was to secure more materials, but Haruki knew better. He was meeting someone, perhaps a contact, someone trusted, someone still willing to barter without a record. It was becoming harder. The officials were tightening their grip, and anyone dealing outside official channels risked more than just a fine. Smuggling wasn't new. But now, it came with the scent of treason. Kyo's voice broke the silence. "You didn't sleep." Haruki didn't look up. "No. You saw someone." He nodded. He knew my name. That stopped her hands. She looked at him, not surprised, just sad, like she'd already expected this moment. Like she had been waiting for it in every quiet hour. He said our lantern was beautiful, Haruki continued, keeping his voice low. Too beautiful. Kyo looked back down at her work. That's what danger looks like now. A brush stroke too perfect. A thread too bright. A word too deep. He asked if I believed beauty came from the gods. Kyo said nothing, but her eyes closed, just briefly. Maybe, Haruki whispered. He was asking if we still believe. That silence between them said everything died in the back room. Aiko played softly. She had begun to whisper to her doll, not in childish nonsense, but in imitation. She was mimicking the words Kyo once spoke during prayer, long ago, when she thought the children were asleep. Aiko didn't understand them, not yet, but they had rhythm. Wait, she was remembering. And that, too, was dangerous. Later, when Daichi returned, his robe smelled of riverbank and cold iron. His hands were empty. No die, no bolts, just silence. They're watching the docks, he said. There are guards at every crossing. Random inspections. Even the fishermen are being questioned now. Did anyone follow you? Haruki asked. I don't think so. Kyo's eyes narrowed. That means nothing. Daichi said heavily, wiping his face with a cloth. We need to burn the writings. No one moved. Kyo's hand curled around her shears. They're not even full texts, just verses. Notes. It's enough, Daichi said. If they find even a line in Latin, we're condemned. Haruki stared at the wall. And if we destroy them, what do we have left? What do we pass on? Daichi didn't answer. He didn't need to. There was nothing to pass on if they were dead. That night, the family gathered in the back room, not for prayer, not for ritual, but for something harder: erasure. Daichi opened the old lacquer box with the writings. Pages worn thin from touch, ink faded to pale brown. These weren't sacred in the way temples used the word, but they were sacred to them. Every word was a lifeline, a memory of something larger than their walls. A story bigger than fear. Kyo unfolded each scrap with the gentleness of a mother handling an infant's clothing. She didn't weep. But her breath hitched once when she saw the page she'd copied years ago, after Aiko was born. Let the little children come to Mesh stared at it for a long time, then handed it to Daichi. He fed it to the flame. One by one, the verses turned to ash. The fire crackled softly. Not violently, no angrily, just slowly. Like it knew what it was being asked to do. Haruki sat closest. His hands trembled once. He didn't stop them. He didn't try to be stoic. That, too, was a kind of lie. One he was tired of. Aiko watched from the shadows, silent, still. When the last page turned black and curled inward, Daichi let the ashes settle. He did not crush them. He simply placed the lid back on the box and closed it. Gently, like closing a book that would never be opened again. But Kyo leaned forward and whispered something as the lid shut. He sees the sparrow fall. It was barely audible, not even a full breath, but it was enough. In that room, in the flickering hush of lamplight, they were no longer hiding. They were mourning. And mourning, too, is holy. They did not pray that night. They didn't dare, but Haruki stayed awake long after the others had laid down. He listened to the wind trace patterns against the eaves. He touched the faint scar on his palm, the one from years ago, where he had pricked himself on a broken needle while sewing a ceremonial kimono for a daimyo's daughter. That needle had drawn blood, but the kimono had earned praise. He'd been proud then. Briefly, until he heard her laugh, dismissive and thoughtless, and realized he would always be invisible. He closed his eyes, and he remembered the verse he hadn't burned, the one he still carried in his sleeve. The one he could never forget. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Not yet. Rain fell the next day, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the dust of Ito's streets into threads of dark mud, bleeding into the cracks between stones like ink on parchment. The city moved slower under rain. Vendors shouted less. Feet shuffled instead of stamped. The bright colors of the festival were gone, and now the world was reduced to grays and browns, a palette of water and silence. Banners sagged in the damp, and paper screens curled at the edges. But to Haruki, it was a kind of mercy. Rain softened everything. It dulled footsteps. It blurred shapes. It made it easier to hide. He stood beneath the shop's awning, arms folded, watching the street beyond. Drops tapped against the edge of the roof, rhythmic, unceasing. The smell of wet wood and dye-soaked cloth filled the air. Kyo worked inside, mending an old sash for resale. They had to be careful now. The shop couldn't afford even a day of stillness. Any silence that lasted too long drew attention. Aiko and Ran were upstairs, silent. Since the burning, the children had become quieter, as though something sacred had left with the smoke. Not fear, something deeper. Reverence, maybe. Or grief. Doichi had not yet returned. He was late. Haruki checked the time again. The small wooden clock near the window ticked steadily, indifferent to whirring. They were used to small delays. A missed delivery, a closed gate, but this felt different. Haruki felt it in the hollow behind his ribs, the part of his chest that ached when something unseen moved through the world just out of reach. Kyo noticed his tension. "He'll be back," she said, not looking up. "I didn't say anything. You didn't have to." Haruki stepped back into the shop, wiping the wet from his sleeves. He shouldn't have gone alone. Not today. Not after the inspection. Not after the man at the festival. Kyo kept sewing. "If we stop doing what we've always done, that's when they'll know." He hated how right she was. Another hour passed. And then came the knock. Not the soft kind. Not the way neighbors knock. This was the sound of authority, firm, measured, final. Kyo's needle stopped in midair. The silence in that pause was louder than any voice. Haruki didn't move at first. His body was braced as though for a blow. The knock came again. 3 sharp strikes. Haruki moved to the door, hard hammering. He opened it a crack. Outside stood a messenger. Young. Thin. A straw hat dripped water. He held out a scroll tied with black thread, not red, not the usual color of minor notices. Black meant formality, severity, possibly death. Tanaka family. The boy asked. Haruki nodded. "Your father has been detained for questioning. He is at the magistrate's court." That was all. No explanation, no charges, no request to attend. Just a single sentence, dropped like a stone into the well of their lives. The boy bowed, turned, and walked into the rain. Haruki shut the door slowly. Behind him, Kyo was already standing. Her face had lost color, but her voice did not tremble. "We have to act," she said. Haruki stared at the scroll. He didn't untie it. What would it say? That Doichi was being held for suspicion of unregistered goods. For failure to contribute enough to the incense fund. For standing too still during a festival parade. Or for something else, for faith, perhaps, for a whisper. For a verse spoken too loud in a room with thin walls. They couldn't know. "We can't go to the court," Haruki said. "Not all of us. That draws more attention." "I'll go," Kyo said. "They won't harm a woman in daylight. Not in the magistrate's hall. You don't know that." "No," she said. "But I know this. If we do nothing, they'll say we fled." "And fleeing is confession." Haruki nodded. His hands trembled slightly, so he tucked them behind his back. Aiko stood in the hallway now, silent, watching. Her doll was gone. She wasn't holding it anymore. Haruki knelt down to her. "You stay with Ren. Don't open the door for anyone. No matter what they say, not unless it's me or your mother." She nodded slowly, then leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. Haruki froze. She hadn't done that in months. When she let go, she said nothing, just returned to the stairs and climbed, one step at a time, like a ghost. By midday, Kyo was gone, and Haruki was alone in the shop, the rain still falling. He waited. Hours passed. He tried to work, to sort orders, to finish stitches, to write down inventory. But his hands wouldn't listen. His thoughts spiraled. He saw Doichi in a stone room, bound. He saw the man from the festival, watching, silently noting. He saw the crucifix, buried in ash beneath their floor, trembling as if it too knew something terrible had begun. Just before dusk, the door opened. Kyo entered. Her robe was soaked. Her hair stuck to her neck. Her face was pale. But she was not alone. Behind her stood Doichi. But he was not like something in him had been bent. Not broken, not yet, but bent enough that you could see the shape of the wound in every motion. His face was blank, too blank. And he did not meet Haruki's eyes. Kyo closed the door behind them. She helped him to the mat. He sat, wordless. "They questioned him for 6 hours," she said softly. "They asked about the shop, about the lantern. About you." Haruki's heart sank. "Me?" Doichi finally spoke. His voice was hoarse. The man from the festival. "He named you. Haruki felt the room tilt. They said you were seen writing something, quoting scripture, not in Japanese. In Latin. I never. Haruki stopped, his breath caught. The verse. The one he carried. The light shines in the darkness. He had copied it by hand, folded it carefully. And the night before the lantern offering, in a moment of pride, he had written the same words in ink on the inside of the lantern's base. Just a line, hidden from view, a final act of faith. He hadn't told anyone, he'd just done it. Daichi looked at him then, and in his eyes was no anger. No blame. Only sorrow. They're watching, he said. Not just us now. You. Especially you. Haruki sank to his knees. He had lit a match, and the city was dry as paper. But even now, even in the sick quiet of guilt, he felt something rising, not defiance. Not even courage, only truth. The light had shone, and darkness had seen it. That night, the rain stopped, but the quiet that followed was heavier than any storm. Ito was hushed in a way that felt unnatural. No dog barked in the alleys. No cart wheels groaned past their door. Even the wind seemed to hold back, as if nature itself sensed the eyes watching from behind shoji screens, from temple eaves, from the black-robed silhouettes that drifted through the city like shadows given flesh. Inside the Tanaka home, the light was dim. A single taper flickered near the doorway, its flame too small to warm the room, too fragile to make anyone feel safe. Haruki sat alone in the back, the crushed remains of silk petals in his lap. He was meant to be assembling fans for a midsummer delivery. The kind noblewomen carried with painted smiles and careful wrists, but his hands would not move. His fingers stayed curled and motionless. Daichi was sleeping or pretending to. He lay beneath a thin blanket, back turned, his breath shallow and even. Kyo had washed his face, bandaged his wrists where the ropes had burned, and said nothing as she did it. When she was done, she had gone to tend to Aiko, who hadn't spoken since the day before. Ren kept watch at the window, pretending to read a scroll he had long since memorized. Their home felt like a place between worlds, not yet destroyed, but no longer whole. And somewhere in Haruki's sleeve, the verse still rested. He hadn't looked at it, not since the magistrate's summons. He was afraid of what it might mean now, afraid of the weight it suddenly carried. It was no longer just comfort. It was evidence. That night, when the others slept, he crept out into the street. He moved like a shadow, his sandals barely touching the stones. The rain had left puddles small, still mirrors, and he avoided them out of instinct. Not for sound, but for what they might reflect. He made his way to the old well behind the shrine. It was a place few visited anymore. The priests had long since moved to newer quarters, and the wooden gate sagged with age, but Haruki knew the path. Fa had come here once, long ago, as a child, when his mother still whispered prayers into his hair and taught him hymns no one else could hear. He stood before the well and reached into his sleeve. The parchment was damp with sweat. Wrinkled at the edges, ink slightly blurred from the press of his skin, he unfolded it. Et lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebrae non comprehenderent. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. He stared at the words. They no longer looked like comfort. They looked like defiance. And suddenly he understood something. The moment he had written them, the moment he placed those words into the heart of the lantern, he had declared war. Not a war with blades or soldiers or banners, but a war of memory. Of meaning. A war for the soul. He looked down into the well. Water glinted faintly at the bottom, reflecting the stars. He could drop it in. Right now. Let the paper vanish into the depths. The evidence would be gone. He could return home. Pretend he had never been anything but what the world expected him to be. Haruki raised the parchment over the well. And then? He stopped, because he realized, if he let it go, they would still come. Whether the words were written or not, the truth had already taken root. In him, in Kyo, in Daichi's worn silence, in Aiko's song, in Ren's stillness. Faith wasn't in the paper. It was in them. He folded the verse and tucked it back into his sleeve. Not to hide it, but to keep it close. When he returned home, the sky had begun to lighten with the approach of dawn. That pale, almost blue color that came before birdsong. Daichi was sitting up, staring at the floor. He didn't speak as Haruki entered, but he looked up just once, and in that glance, something passed between them. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but recognition. They both knew now. The line had been crossed. There was no turning back. Later that day, the neighborhood official returned. He arrived without warning. No escort. No ceremony. Just a single knock, like the first crack of ice before it breaks. Kyo opened the door. The man stepped in, removing his sandals politely. He wore a dull gray Harry and thin glasses, harmless at a glance. But his eyes scanned the room with surgical precision. "I've come to speak with the eldest son," he said. Haruki stepped forward. The man bowed. "You've been mentioned, you know," he said lightly. "At the court. At the port. Even by your customers. They say you're clever. That you write poems." Haruki said nothing. "They also say you're quiet. Reserved. Not like the other boys your age." Still, Haruki did not speak. The man smiled. "I admire that. Discipline. Restraint." He took a small step forward. "But I wonder, do you ever write private things? Thoughts, ideas, maybe, forbidden's texts?" Haruki's mouth was dry. "I write merchant records. And die formulas, of course," the man said. "But even formulas can be dangerous. Ink, after all, is memory. Memory becomes belief. And belief becomes rebellion." He let that word hang. Rebellion. The air tightened. Haruki bowed. "We are loyal to the shogunate." "Good," the man replied. "Then you won't mind if we return tomorrow. For a full review. Paper. Records. Materials. Everything. Pause. And if we find nothing," he said, smiling gently, "then perhaps we'll stop watching." He turned and left. No threats, just time. They had until morning. The door closed behind him. Are you okay? Turned to his mother, his voice steady. "We bury it, everything, tonight." Kyo nodded. And as Daichi rose, slowly, painfully, and the children watched in silence, the family moved in quiet unity. They no longer hoped to survive by hiding what they believed. Now, they prayed only to survive long enough to pass it on. Night fell like a curtain soaked in all, thick, heavy, suffocating. Every breath inside the Tanaka home felt borrowed. The house was quiet, but not still. Beneath the floorboards, hands moved, swift, silent, purposeful. The space beneath the back room, a crawl space only Daichi and Haruki could reach, had once stored spare bolts of rejected cloth, old charcoal ink blocks, and winter sandals. Now, it was where they'd buried their past, scrolls, parchments, the little box of ash from the burned verses. A wooden rosary carved by Daichi's grandfather, worn smooth from years of hidden prayer. A faded booklet bound in rice paper, a catechism, smuggled in from Nagasaki more than 2 decades ago. It had lived behind a panel in the wall for years, and touched, tonight, it would go into the earth. They worked without speaking. Words were dangerous now, even inside their own walls. Ren helped. He held the lantern while Daichi dug. Aiko slept, or pretended to. Kyo wrapped each object in wax cloth, then layered them carefully, as if tucking children in for a cold night. Ryukei handled the verse. He didn't want to bury it. Not really. But they had no choice. Not if they wanted to live. Daichi's fingers bled as he dug. The ground was hard, wet from the rain. The shovel made no sound. There was no shovel. Only a piece of broken bamboo sharpened at one end. A tool meant for gardening, not for survival. When the hole was ready, Kyo placed the objects inside. She hesitated before letting go of the rosary. Her lips moved just barely. A soundless prayer. A whisper even God might miss. Then she let it fall. Haruki followed, unfolding the parchment one last time. The ink had begun to fade from the sweat of his sleeve, but the words were still there. Et lux in tenebris lucet. He didn't bury it out of fear. He buried it like a seed. As they covered the hole, the earth took on a sacred silence, as though it, too, understood what it now held. When the last layer of soil was pressed flat, Daichi sat back, gasping. Kyo took his hand. Haruki closed the trapdoor. No creak, no sound. Only the faint scent of wet soil in the air. It was done. For now. But safety is not silence. Safety is illusion. And illusions, in Edo, never lasted. They cleaned the house, removed every scrap of writing that could be seen as foreign, subversive, or holy. Even the brush strokes Haruki practiced as a boy. Thin calligraphy copied from Portuguese hymns were washed away with vinegar and cloth. The ink smeared into shadows on rice paper, then vanished. At dawn, they dressed in their plainest robes. No colors, no adornments. Kyo brushed Aiko's hair into a modest bun and told her not to speak unless spoken to. Daichi folded a small towel over his bandaged wrist. Ren polished the threshold. Haruki set the scrolls of shop ledgers in perfect stacks, their handwriting precise, inoffensive. Then they waited. The sun rose slowly. Its light was thin and gray, filtered through cloud. The footsteps came just after the second hour. Not many, just 3. But 3 was enough to end a family. The door opened before they knocked. Kyo bowed deeply. "Welcome, honored officials. Please enter." The first man, the one with the glasses, nodded without speaking. Behind him stood 2 younger men, both expressionless, robes plain. Not samurai. Not soldiers. Bureaucrats. The most dangerous kind. The ones who didn't need swords to destroy you. They stepped inside. And began. They didn't speak much. Didn't accuse. They moved like physicians examining a corpse, gentle, methodical, cold. One lifted scrolls. Another examined the die ledger, cross-checking with names on a separate record book. The eldest official watched Haruki the whole time, not glaring. Just watching. "Where are your tools for calligraphy?" he asked suddenly. Haruki bowed. "Burned, after the inspection last week. We feared improper use of ink might be misunderstood." "A wise decision," the man said. "Tell me, have you ever studied Portuguese?" Haruki's heart skipped. "No, honored one. Not even Latin. I've only learned merchant numerals. Enough to track orders and bartering terms from Nagasaki." The official smiled faintly. "Such wisdom from one so young. May I see your hands?" Haruki hesitated, then held them out. The man took them, turned them over. "Smooth," he murmured. "No calluses from a blade. No ink stains either." He let go. "You sew?" "Yes." Haruki nodded. "Then your thread must be strong. And precise." "I try to make it so." The man looked toward the others. "The shop appears clean." No relief followed, because the pause after those words was too long. Finally, he turned toward the back room. And beneath the floorboards, Kyo's breath caught. Haruki stepped forward. "We keep only tools there. Bare bolts of cloth. Discarded things." "We'll see," the man said gently. The trapdoor opened. They pulled everything out. Old straw sandals. Rusted die spoons. Mice droppings. Dried ink cakes. A broken rice pot. But not the spot. Not the one they dug. Because Daichi, clever Daichi, had buried it deeper. Beneath the first layer of storage. Beneath even the crawlspace boards. He had used the narrow path that led into the wall's foundation. A hidden cavity left when the home was expanded years ago. They didn't even look for it. Why would they? The officials saw nothing. No books. No crosses. No paper of faith. And in a city ruled by evidence. No evidence meant no crime. An hour later, the inspectors left. The man with glasses turned before the door closed. "You are a well-disciplined family. I commend your humility." His eyes found Haruki again. "But I wonder when there is nothing left to hide. What remains of the soul?" He smiled. And was gone. The door closed. The silence returned. Daichi collapsed onto the floor. Not from pain. From the unbearable weight of being spared. Kyo wept. Ren turned away, his fists clenched. Aiko, still silent, climbed into her mother's lap and closed her eyes. Haruki stood motionless. He should have felt triumph. But what he felt was something else. This wasn't victory. This was a warning. The darkness had not won. In the nights that followed, silence became their language. No one dared speak of what had passed, not because of fear, not entirely. But because even relief, in a place like Edo, was fragile. Too much of it drew attention. Too loud a sigh and someone might think you'd been hiding something. And they had. But the officials were gone. For now, the papers remained buried. The walls remained unbroken. The Tanakas were still together, still standing. Yet nothing felt whole. Haruki couldn't sleep. Not fully. Not restfully. He lay on his side long after the house had gone quiet, eyes fixed on the cracked beam overhead. His mind drifted to the sound of the official's voice. When there is nothing left to hide, what remains of the soul? The question clung to him, not like a riddle, like a bruise. And in that quiet, he realized something. What they had buried wasn't just parchment. It wasn't even just faith. It was themselves. Because everything else in their lives, the shop, the rice, the dyes, the thread, it could all be named. Bought. Tax. Replaced. But the words they'd whispered into each other's ears in the dark, those were beyond cataloging. Beyond price. They were the parts of their humanity that the Empire had no room for. And still, the Empire watched. Even after the inspectors left, there were signs. A neighbor who stopped speaking to them. A delivery that arrived a day too late. A cart that lingered a little too long across from their shop. It was subtle. But it was there. The message was clear. You have not been forgotten. Kyo felt it, too. She cleaned obsessively now. Not out of pride, but as if wiping the dust from shelves could erase the scent of suspicion. Aiko rarely sang. Ren spent more time in the alley, watching, listening. As if trying to understand what silence truly meant. And Daichi. He no longer prayed. Not even in his sleep. One evening, Haruki returned from the market to find Daichi at the loom, alone. The thread was snapped. He hadn't noticed. You're using the wrong tension, Haruki said softly. Daichi blinked, then looked down. He rose slowly, the stiffness in his limbs clear. Haruki stepped closer. You haven't touched that loom since the inspection. Daichi gave a dry laugh. It used to be mine, now it feels like it belongs to them. Haruki hesitated. It doesn't. Daichi didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his robe and pulled something out, a small, crumpled piece of paper, folded over itself many times, worn thin. Haruki recognized it instantly. It was his verse. Daichi hadn't buried it. He'd hidden it again. Without a word, he handed it back. Haruki took it, fingers trembling. He unfolded it slowly. The ink was almost gone, but the words were still there. Et lux in tenebris lucet. And Haruki said, for the first time in days, aloud, the light shines in the darkness. Daichi looked up. His eyes, red-rimmed. Does it? Haruki's answer came as a whisper, a breath. A promise. It always has. A silence followed. But not the kind that choked. This one felt like breath after drowning. That night, the family gathered. Not to pray. Not to weep. Not even to remember. Just to sit. Together. No roles. No duty. No hierarchy. They were just human. And in that stillness, Kyo did something unexpected. She sang. Quietly. Old words. A lullaby from her mother's tongue. Not Latin. Not even Japanese. Just an old village melody, long since forbidden in the cities. A song about light on water, about small things surviving storms. About the moon watching, even when no one else could see. Aiko hummed along before she realized. Even Daichi smiled. And Haruki looked at the verse in his lap. And for the first time in weeks, he did not feel watched. He felt seen. He closed his eyes. And whispered into the silence, we are still here. And the silence, that sacred silence, whispered back. Yes. Summer deepened like bruises on fading skin, slow, dark, and hard to ignore. Ito was hot in a way that made even the shadows sweat. The sun pressed down on the city like punishment, squeezing every alley dry, turning the river's edge sour and thick. The air tasted of boiled stone and old lacquer. In the streets, vans flicked like moth wings. Merchants wiped their necks with cloths already soaked through. Even the shrine drums were quieter, dulled by the weight of heat. But at the Tanaka house, it was not the heat that made it hard to breathe. It was waiting. Something had shifted. The inspectors hadn't returned. But neither had normalcy. There was no knock, no summons, no accusation. Just a stillness that felt calculated to be safety, as if the city were watching them breathe, only to see if they would forget to be afraid. They hadn't. Daichi stayed in the shop now, rarely speaking. He mended seams that didn't need fixing. Tied knots that would never be undone. Not working, performing work. His hands had become a theater. Kyo had resumed selling to the public. Small items, mostly. Fabric scraps, needles, fans, the occasional ribbon or dyed cord. Nothing too elaborate. Nothing too beautiful. Beauty, after all, still meant risk. But Haruki couldn't stop dreaming of it. He saw it everywhere. In the way the sunlight filtered through paper screens. In the curl of incense smoke from the neighboring house. In the way Aiko twirled a strip of dyed silk around her finger and whispered stories to herself when she thought no one was listening. He saw it. And it ached. Because it meant he still believed. Even now. Even after everything. One evening, as the day drained into that strange, gold hour where everything looked like it belonged to someone else's life, Haruki slipped away from the shop. He didn't tell anyone. He walked through the old quarter, where walls leaned too close together and cats darted between pots. Past the tea shops and the paper merchant, past the school with the broken gate, past the place where his father once traded for salted fish in the winter months. He ended up at the shrine again, not the new one, the old one, crumbling into the forest's edge, where moss had claimed the corners and vines coiled around forgotten altars like prayer ropes. He climbed the steps slowly. At the top, the air was cooler. The city's weight felt further away. A small wooden statue sat crooked at the heart of the shrine, faded and worn. The features were nearly gone, weathered by sun and time. No incense burned here anymore. No coins in the offering box. Just silence and dust, Haruki said. And for a long time, he didn't speak. He just listened to the creak of trees, the faraway cry of a nightbird. The sound of his own heart still beating. Still his. And then, quietly, not in Latin, not in Japanese, not even in words, he prayed. Not for safety, not for peace. But for truth, for the strength to carry it. Even if no one ever saw it, even if it lived only in his hands, in his stitches, in the silence of what he chose not to destroy. When he finally rose, the city below was bathed in shadow. He descended the steps slowly, one hand trailing the wooden rail. The path home was quiet. No one followed, but he knew now if the darkness returned, it would not find him hollow. It would find him whole. Back at the shop, Daichi was still seated in the workroom. Aiko slept curled up beside a bolt of dyed blue silk. Ren read aloud to her softly, an old folktale, one with spirits in trees and foxes that wore the faces of men. Haruki stepped inside. Kyo turned from the stove. You were gone a long time, she said, not accusing. Just weary. I needed air, he replied. She studied his face. Did you find it? No, he said. I found something better. She waited. But he didn't explain. That night, he returned to the old verse, unfolding it with care. And for the first time since the inspection, he dipped his brush in ink. Not to copy it. Not to preserve it, but to translate it. Word by word. Line by line. Not from Latin to Japanese, but from fear to memory. From the private to the permanent. He painted it onto a scrap of cloth, not paper. Cloth could be worn. Moved. Hidden in seams. Sewn into the very breath of a life. He let it dry. Then folded it once, then twice, and stitched it into the hem of Aiko's kimono. The stitch was invisible, but the words were there. The light shines in the darkness, and now the darkness would have to search harder to find them. He would stitch it into more things, soon into collars, into sleeves, into obi cords and sashes. A language that passed from hand to cloth to soul. No one would see it, but it would be everywhere. And that, he thought, was faith. Not shouting. Not fire, but thread. Thread that does not break. Autumn crept into Edo on quiet feet, not with thunder or ceremony, but in the way leaves lost their color overnight, and the wind began to whisper secrets no one had asked to hear. The heat broke. The air shifted, even the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of fear. It was something stranger, deeper, the kind that settles after a tragedy has passed, but before anyone dares to breathe again. The kind that asked, have we truly survived, or are we just waiting to fall again? Inside the Tanaka household, things had grown. Careful. Not peaceful, not safe, but careful. Kyo spoke a little more. She resumed mending silk with a certain grace, her fingers moving with that old rhythm, the kind that made the work feel like music. Aiko began humming again. Always when she thought no one was listening, old lullabies, nonsense rhymes, fragments of things no one had taught her. Daichi, though. Daichi remained quiet. He woke early, worked steadily, ate little, and each night, before bed, he stared at the trapdoor. He never opened it, but he watched it, as if waiting for it to speak. Are you Kai? Noticed. He noticed everything now. The way the neighbors no longer made eye contact. The way coin purses felt lighter, even when full. The way customers flinched at the mention of custom work, as if creativity had become synonymous with treason. But still, they stitched, they dyed, they sold, and quietly. They remembered. Haruki had become a tailor of truths. Each week, he embroidered a line of memory into cloth, not with words, no tanamore, but with marks. Simple patterns, codes only he could read. A slash of blue thread on the inner collar meant hope indoors. A looped silver stitch along the hem said faith, unseen. 3 knots in red silk, hidden beneath a cuff. You are not alone. No one noticed. And that was the point. Rebellion had become invisible. One afternoon, As the wind began to turn sharp and the trees whispered through yellowed leaves, a letter arrived. Not official. Not sealed in black thread. Just a plain fold of rice paper, tied with string. Delivered by a courier boy who didn't wait for a reply. It was addressed to Haruki. His heart caught in his throat as he unwrapped it. Inside: no threats. No accusations. Just a single line. In the same careful brushstroke he had seen at the Lantern Festival, there are others, and beneath it, a mark, not a name, but a symbol, a fish. Drawn with a single stroke. Haruki's breath shook. He had heard of this before. In whispers, in riddles. The symbol was ancient, older than Edo, older than any shogun. A mark of the underground church, hidden communities. Wanderers who passed scripture from hand to hand, mouth to ear, soul to soul, not dead, just buried, like the verse beneath their house, like the light stitched into cloth. Like him. He stared at the page long after it stopped feeling real. Kyo found him there. He didn't hide it. She read it once. Said nothing, but her hands trembled. Finally, she looked at him. Do you believe them? He nodded. I don't know who sent it, but someone saw our lantern. Someone read it. A long silence. Then, softly, do we follow them? Haruki's voice was quiet. I think. We wait. For what? For them to find us again. Kyo folded the letter and tucked it into the sash of her robe. Her eyes were darker than usual. No, she said. We don't wait. Haruki looked up. She didn't mean it in defiance. She meant it in purpose. We continue. And he understood. The message was a spark. But sparks needed breath. They couldn't seek others. That would bring fire to their door, but they could become the kind of people who should be found. That evening, Haruki stitched another piece of truth, this time, into a sash for a nobleman's daughter, one who would never know, never suspect, never see. But someone, someday, might inherit it, might touch it, might feel it. He wove 3 black threads through the lining. Shaped them into a wave imperceptible unless you were searching. The fish. Hidden in the current. And just beneath it, across, 2 lines. That was all, but in Edo, 2 lines in the wrong place could mean everything. He finished the stitch just before nightfall. And as the light dimmed, he whispered aloud, find us. We are still here. We are waiting. Winter arrived in silence, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Snow settled over Edo in pale sheets, softening every rooftop, every threshold. It buried the noise of footsteps. It turned alleyways into tunnels of stillness. Even the river moved slower beneath its thin veil of frost. To those watching from above, it might have looked peaceful, even beautiful. But inside the Tanaka house, the stillness meant something else. It meant another season had passed, and they were still alive. Still unseen, still unheard, but not forgotten. The message with the fish had not been the last. In the weeks that followed, more had arrived. Quietly, secretly, folded into bolts of cloth from outlying villages. Scribbled inside the lining of a delivery pouch. Once, written faintly in chalk on the back wall of the shrine Haruki had prayed at. No names, no locations, only phrases. Hold fast. The river runs beneath. They cannot burn what is already ash. Each one different. Each one proof. There was a movement out there, not armies, not riots, not open defiance. Something quieter, more enduring. A faith that flowed underground. It was not a network of resistance. It was something older than that, a memory held in the body. In gestures, in signs, in silence, Kyo began teaching Aiko to sew, not just patterns, but codes. How to hide a symbol in a hem. How to read the color of thread not as decoration, but as message. How to know when silence was safety and when it was signal. They called it practice, but it wasn't. It was inheritance. Doichi grew quieter as the snow deepened, but his presence was steadier. He had returned to prayer, not in words, not aloud, but in the way he worked, the care in his stitches. The way he set the tea with deliberate gentleness, as though grace could be poured into a cup. Even Ren had changed. He no longer asked who the messages came from. He just watched, learned, memorized. We are still here. We will always be here. Even when you forget our names, we remember yours. He did not shout. He did not write. He simply existed. In defiance, in devotion, in love, in the thread between silence and survival. And somewhere, out in the snow-shadowed distance, a candle flickered back. One day, Haruki caught him tracing the symbol of the fish on the frost-covered window. He didn't stop him. Let the world see it melt. One night, Just before the new year, a stranger came to the shop. A woman, middle-aged, modest robes. Eyes like candlelight, warm but careful. She asked for a burial shroud. One to be dyed with indigo and stitched with care. For a sister, she said. She died young. Haruki nodded, took the order. Before she left, she placed a coin on the counter. Silver, but not local. Portuguese, and on the coin, barely visible, a cross. She did not bow when she left. She looked Haruki in the eye. "You so well," she said. "And then, we remember." That was all, but it was enough. After she left, Haruki stood motionless for a long time. Then he locked the shop early. Sat with his family by the low fire. They didn't speak. But their silence felt different that night. Not tense, not watchful, full, like silence with roots. Later, when the house was still, Haruki pulled out a fresh scrap of cloth. He stitched slowly, carefully. No symbols this time, no codes, just a line, written in silk, in Japanese, a phrase his father used to say when he thought no one heard. Even the smallest candle keeps the dark away. He held the cloth to the firelight, watched it glow, then folded it, tucked it into his sleeve, and stepped outside. Snow fell softly around him, blurring the lanterns of the distant quarter, softening the spines of the wooden roofs. He stood still, face to the sky, and whispered, "We are still here. We will always be here. Even when you forget our names, we remember yours." He did not shout. He did not write. He simply existed. In defiance. In devotion. In love. In the thread between silence and survival. And somewhere, out in the snow shadow, Distancia candle flickered back. And now, the story dims. The last candle flickers. The thread is tied. And what remains is not silence, but a kind of stillness. A breath held between generations. A memory sewn into the lining of time. We may never know how many like the Tanakas lived and died beneath the weight of silence. How many buried faith in floorboards, stitched hope into seams, whispered truth when truth could kill. But their stories did not vanish. They live in the quiet. They live in the cloth. They live in us. So if you've made it this far, if the snow is falling outside your window, or your room is still and warm, take a moment now. Breathe in, let the stillness settle around you like soft silk. And remember, history is not just names and wars. It's people. People who endured. People who resisted, not always with swords, but with love, with silence, with thread. Dim the lights, if you haven't already. Let your body rest. And if you feel something stir in your chest, something quiet, something that lingers like a prayer you almost remember, hold on to it. You've just walked beside the forgotten. You've just felt the weight of invisible truth. And that stays with you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Let us know where you're watching from. We read everyone. And if this story found you in the quiet hours, perhaps share it. Let it drift softly, like snow. Let it find another soul in the stillness. Until next time, sleep gently, dream deeply, and remember, even the smallest candle keeps the dark away.